Okay, hope everybody can see the slide. Uh, yeah, let me start off by making a minor correction. I'm not a professional chef. I've trained as a professional chef, but I've never worked in that position and hope to never be in that position. Uh, Sometimes knowledge is better than action. A little more about background as it reflects this. So I've taught recreational style cooking classes for 10 years at Sur La Table, 5 years of teaching in the San Mateo County Jail. I've taught also for that same period of time in a job training center. I've spoke at the CIA. Actually, I've been involved with both CIAs. My college research was funded by the other CIA. I have done various classes over the years. I don't consider myself an active teacher at this point. It's not how I want to spend all my time, but it's fun to do it once in a while. So another caveat, I wrote an article on the same subject, and which was just rejected. And the reviewer took issue with the fact that how I define culinary education. And so I thought right up front here, because you'll get it from all the examples in this talk today, but I look at culinary education in the broadest extent possible. If you call up a friend and you ask them, how do I boil an egg? And they give you in 3 sentences how to boil an egg, you've gotten some culinary education. It doesn't have to be a formal class. It doesn't have to be for professionals, which this reviewer thought that culinary education was only in a professional sense. And I've shortened the title because I went from initially down to a shorter period of time. So I decided just to settle on America, which is the area I know best anyway. So I won't be doing just mostly in America. It'll be all in America. So let's get started. So one aspect that to keep in mind, people often don't think about it, is that the cooking is class related. Okay? And what I mean by that is, come on, keyboard, do your thing, is that if you can afford to have someone cook for you, you hire a cook or eat away from the home, where you like to, eat away from where you live. If you can't afford to hire a cook, you learn to get by. Yeah, it's now this, certainly in my case, I cook half the time and I eat out half the time, but that is still related somewhat to my class. So you'll see in the history of culinary education, there is a lot of training of how to train the head of the house to teach the servants how to cook. And that's partly where I get this idea that, it's class related. And so now, in the modern world, the market for culinary education is divided between home cooks and professional cooks. Let's leave that at that. So it's somewhere along the line, I got to define what cooking is. This is a combination definition, out of the OED. They didn't have one that was quite, they had all these different caveats. So I got rid of those, all the gotcha words, and simplified it. And it goes to what a lot of people say, it's the act of heating the food, making it ready to eat. And which of course gets around, there's a lot of raw foods we eat. So it isn't, that cooking or not. I prefer to looking at cooking in a different way. So cooking is an activity that presupposes methods, techniques, and ingredients. It's a knowledge of those 3 items that allows us to cook. And in fact, what culinary education does, when done right, it illuminates methods, techniques, and ingredients. So going back to the early days of mankind, since I define culinary education as just the word of mouth from one person to another, you can say that culinary education really is timeless. It's gone on since one person taught somebody else how to, cook that piece of meat that, or grind up the grain that was gathered. But since we're talking America, we'll start with the colonial period. For those outside the US, the colonial period roughly starts in 1607, which is the first permanent settlement in what I would call English America. St. Augustine, which was Spanish, was settled before that, but what grew out of the British colonial America is what became the country. So 1607 is the start, and it ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which goes into effect in 1784. So roughly it's the 17th and 18th century. During the colonial period, culinary education is primarily person to person. It can be between family members. There's a number of records where chefs were hired to teach enslaved cooks, although I imagine a number of them learned their trade from other enslaved cooks. And depending on where people were, what their desire to learn was in some cases, the knowledge could be limited or it could be quite expansive. So the other thing that happens a lot, and especially, obviously among the wealthy, not among the poor, is family written manuscript cookbooks. It's the handwritten cookbooks. These are anything, in some cases, they're just memory aids, in other ways they're sharing, because these things get passed from generations to generation. The most famous we have nowadays is the two which are given the name the Martha Washington cookbooks, which she had in her possession from 1749 to 1799. Martha Washington, there's no record of her ever cooking there is no entries by her in these books, but these were family books that she passed along. Also, there was the imported books from Britain primarily. They were brought, by immigrants when they came. Some were purchased in the colony. Probably the most famous or the most common during the colonial period was Hannah Glass. And in 1742, someone published, they decided, well, we'll take some of these British books and we'll publish them here instead of having to ship them over. And the first one for that is Complete Housewife by Eliza Smith. They took the fifth London edition and adapted it to colonial Virginia. So it's not, if you compare the two, they're not exactly the same. We move up to the cusp of the 19th century. So right at the turn of the 19th century, we have the first cookbook written and published in the US. And one of the unique things about it is that it emphasizes American ingredients. You have cornmeal and the squashes, beans, certain things that are indigenous to the Americas, which a lot of by this time are beginning to make their way into Europe. But she actually introduces a lot of this. It's the first known recipe for actually the first known mention for cranberry sauce. She doesn't give a recipe for it, but she does mention it. It's not a big book, 48 pages, and which 13 were just general information. Essentially, nothing is owned by the author. You can see on the cover of the first edition, it was by Amelia Simmons, an American orphan. Whether that was true or not, no one really knows. There's some guesses of she might have been someone's cook. And it got pirated a lot, like all good books. And one thing you probably should mention in this period of cookbooks is that Amelia Simmons, a good portion of her recipes show up in earlier books, and that was a common thing. Let me go back here for a second. One thing I want to. So one of the things about the Complete Housewife, this was not intended for the housewife necessarily to cook with. It was intended, it's my understanding from what I've read in other places, it was intended more for the housewife to work with the household help in cooking. And this is, going back to the 17th century, there's a whole range of books in Britain of this nature that contain not only food, but medicines, farming information, all sorts of stuff that are really designed so the reader of the book becomes the teacher rather than the person who actually uses it. So let's move up now to the pre-Civil War era. So Civil War starts in 1860. And we find that during this period, cooking knowledge is still primarily person to person. There are, the continuation of manuscript cookbooks, a lot of which are now beginning to get transcribed so that they're available for the rest of the world to enjoy. The publication rate of printed cookbooks increases at this point. It's still, most of them are primarily just recipe books, so at this point. You have the introduction of the cooking stove. So we move from the hearth to the stove, or begin to do that during this period. And that, of course, makes a difference. So the first cooking school that we know about was Mrs. Goodfellow in Philadelphia. She didn't write anything about the school herself. There's been a book written about it, which when I looked through it, it seemed to be mostly a record of what she bought, to supply the school. The school did stress pastry. It operated for about 30 years. And although she didn't write about it, Eliza Leslie in her first book memorialized it with recipes that almost totally came from Mrs. Goodfellow. There is mention in some books, the Oxford Companion to Food and Cookery mentions there was a few people who were teaching pastry in the Northeast, but that's all it is, and I haven't found any actual period reference for that. Also in the pre-Civil War area, you have Catherine Beecher, sometimes working with her sister, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which some of you may have heard about. And she writes a couple of significant books, but beginning to look at cooking not only from the standpoint of recipes, but the concept of home economics, which we would call later. Her books talk about procurement, cooking for the sick, hiring, counseling, domestic help, setting the table, and kitchen furniture, which is one of the most interesting things. She's the first person that I can find that proposed kitchen cabinets. Kitchens up to this point were unfurnished, with maybe a table, a high shelf to keep things away from the rats, but a lot of things were just stored on the floor. She also started the Hartford Female Seminary, which was one of about 60 of these, mostly in the Northeast, which were essentially non-accredited, if you will, colleges for women that were designed to parallel similar things that existed for men. When we move into the post-Civil War, we have the Second Industrial Revolution, which affects cooking on many levels. So first of all, we get cheap steel with the invention of the Bessner process, where steel becomes widely available. We have just a huge increase in the amount of kitchen tools. When you go through the patents, what you find is that it's like, it's exponential growth in kitchen tools, a lot of which of course don't work, but growth nonetheless. And we start seeing, because during the Second Industrial Revolution, we have the movement of people from rural to urban. 1830, only 10% of Americans lived in cities. By 1890, 50% lived in cities. And you have a change in terminology that comes about where dinner becomes lunch. Dinner used to be the midday meal, but during this time, as things get industrialized, there's no time for people to go home for dinner anymore and eat lunch. Dinner becomes the evening meal. So supper is replaced by that. You also have the start of community cookbooks, which are books raised by community groups, towns, schools, churches, things of that nature, where they have recipe collections. And these although they're done usually as fundraisers and a way of sharing, it was really a way for a lot of people to learn how to cook, people at home. They learn, from their neighbors what to do. You also have the beginning of more cooking schools. Pierre Blot is one who's mentioned, who was a French immigrant, and did a bunch of lecturing. He was popular for about 10 years and then seemed to disappear off the planet. Women's seminaries, once again, like I said, there's up to about 60. All of them had some sort of cooking programs as part of their work. And then maybe the most significant part of it is in 1862, the Morrill Act, which creates the land-grant college system. So there's, at this point, there wasn't, I think, maybe somebody can tell me how many states there was in 1862, but not as many as we have now, certainly. But the idea was to create one college in every state. The purpose of the college was to teach agriculture, but as part of that, then the teaching of cooking, which was related to agriculture in people's minds, also gets started. And this continues up to the day when Hawaii became a state in 1959. University of Hawaii became a land-grant college and got money for that. Late 19th, early 20th century, we have continuing Miss Parloa. Maria Parloa is probably the best known of people starting in this period. She starts in Boston. And her school specifically, she would have periods which were exclusively for household help. So if the translation was necessary, then maybe the employer would come with the household help, but her midday classes were for, basically for the housewife, and the evening classes were for the help. We also have the development of settlement houses, which are more immigrant-based, and those generally had cooking schools to introduce immigrants to American cooking. The most famous cookbook to come out of that was the Settlement House Cookbook by Cantor, but that's not until the 20th century. What happens in here now, as people become more industrialized, or as the world becomes more industrialized, the children are less able to benefit from person-to-person learning within their family. So they need to have outside sources of education. Women's magazines start in 1885. Most of them do not have much on cooking, Good Housekeeping being the exception. 1898, the Boston Cooking School magazine gets started. It's more cooking, primarily cooking, but a common thing of the women's magazines was women's fiction. And there's some of that even in the early Boston Cooking School magazine, which goes all the way up until the beginning of the Second World War. In 1914, we get the Smith-Lever Act, which creates the cooperative farm extensions. So these tend to be more by county than state, and they still exist in most counties. They are there to help the farmers farm better. But part of that is culinary training for rural residents. And those continue today. A lot of times, these have moved from the farm extension to the local libraries. And there's a lot of cooking instruction done still in local libraries around the country. So also in this period, we have the start of women's sections in local newspapers. There's some early stuff in going back from the World Herald, I think in the 1830s, has a little bit for women, but the growth throughout local newspapers is the women's section. They concentrate on what was called the 4 R's: family, food, furnishings, and fashions. The writers were generally women, and they were restricted to only writing for the women's section. And they would generally, at this point, because now space becomes an issue, they present recipes without method and without technique. Those are assumed that you know that, and they provide just the recipes. Manuscript cookbooks now are beginning to give way to different forms. You know, people, the availability of cookbooks are much larger, literacy rates are up. And so you find more people scribbling notes in their cookbook. And you have things like the Good Housekeeping Cookbook, which comes out in 1903, Settlement House Cookbook, which was my mother's big book. There are a number of these, and you still can run into people who have their, you know, what it may now be their grandmother's copy that's falling apart, but there's notes written all over it. Also, many people started scrapbooks at this point, you know, where they would, you know, cut recipes out of the newspaper and things and paste them into to books. During the Depression, we get radio broadcasting. You know, Betty Crocker was born as a radio personality in 1924. If anybody doesn't know who she is, I can talk about that later. The USDA presents the Housekeeper's Half Hour, which most people know as Aunt Sammy. It was designed mainly for rural stations. The government would write the scripts, and then a local personality would read the script as part of these half-hour programs. This was, you know, 5 days a week, generally around lunchtime. And various forms of daily programming pretty much existed until the end of the century. In San Francisco, which is the 9th largest radio market, we had someone doing it all the way up until the early 90s. And an interesting thing about these more live programs which were done is they didn't present recipes. That was difficult to do over the air. So they were really there to answer questions, and they really got heavily into methods and techniques, which was, you know, important for people to learn. Also during the Depression, we get The Joy of Cooking published. The first edition was only 3,000 copies, so it's just for Irma Rombauer's friends, more or less. But in 1936, it becomes the first, what is now considered a national cookbook. And, you know, without at least the overt regionalities, there certainly was many regionalities because a lot of it was based on, although she was born in America, her parents were German immigrants, Protestant immigrants, and a lot of it is based on that. She was raised upper middle class, and The Joy of Cooking came about because her husband lost money on the stock exchange when the market crashed and committed suicide, and she took her $3,000 in savings, which would, or $6,000 in savings, which would publish 3,000 books. I forgot the numbers, but she rolled the dice, and it became successful. I should say on that though, the Fanny Farmer Cookbook, the Boston School cooking book, which originally comes out in 1896, was the #1 seller in the US in those days. And it wasn't until the mid-40s that The Joy of Cooking overtook that. Also, newspapers and magazines continue to expand, not only in their reach, but also in their the size of their food sections. And then we get to the post-war period. So although there are early cooking programs, there's actually some in the 30s, short-run programs in England. I don't remember, I think the earliest US ones were still in the late 40s. Local things didn't go very long or have much of a reach, but the real beginning starts with the French Chef. It starts in 1963, ran for 10 seasons. It was the start of many shows in a similar vein. You have Joyce Chen with Chinese cooking program starts a year after that. Most of them only last, for 10 seasons at the most. And the way that the people who are making these shows make money actually is by selling the cookbooks. One of the things that they brought with them, they was created the 3 recipe sort of style of producing. The shows would have 3 recipes, and even though the recipe may be what was being prepared, it was being demonstrated. So methods and techniques were being shown to people. Whether they understood that at the time is, who knows. Then in the post-war period, we get the development of professional cooking schools. First was 1946, which is when the CIA starts Culinary Institute of America. It was not called that originally, but it's not until the 1970s that we really get most of or a lot of the schools started. They're there to take advantage of the GI Bill, which then later there is federal vocational money, and some were actually started in order to get the students to take loans under this professional training program, and they have now been sued. They're closed, gone bankrupt. They've been sued by the students because they didn't really teach people how to cook. Most of these schools were designed to prepare, people to be hotel cooks, not chefs. And like I said, most of these schools are gone now. The number of actual professional cooking schools has shrunk quite a bit. What has replaced it is the development of job training center, not replaced it necessarily, but what has grown during this same period of time. And they run the gamut from very entry level, which was what I was involved with, to actual professional chef training that are 2-year programs, generally funded by the state or the county in some way or another. We also have cookware stores in the late 20th century, starting what they called cooking schools. It was recreational cooking, and it got to the point when I started in early part of the century where we're trying to teach people to cook. By the time I got fired 10 years later, that was not the interest. The interest was to sell products and to provide a recreational a period, for people could come and to be entertained. It was killed by nationalism and lifestyle. And what I mean by that is that most of the cooking schools or much of the cooking stores have gone from being stores where you bought cookware to being lifestyle stores. So it's more than just the cookware industry. You also have the modern cooking magazines. Certainly Gourmet went back to the early 40s, but most of these magazines start up, in the last part of the 20th century. They're no longer women's magazines. Although there is an emphasis more towards women, men are not excluded from it. And they have also morphed from teaching cooking to teaching lifestyle, or be more lifestyle oriented, more talk about things outside the kitchen. Fine Cooking magazine, which I think was the best of all of them, was very heavily into techniques and really how to cook. They have since gone out of business, and their brand was bought by another company that specializes in lifestyle magazines. Cookbooks still sell well, as other books have gotten replaced by electronic means. Cookbooks are still selling well, and it's increasing. So those are not going away. The Food Network, which starts in the 90s, started off like other instructional TV and really has morphed. So it's just an entertainment network now. It's very hard to find a program on the Cooking Network or the Food Network that actually tries to or claims to teach you how to cook. There's a plethora of under the radar programs. The research chefs, the people who figure out how to take a small recipe of macaroni and cheese and do 50,000 pounds in a batch. These have the culinology program, which is started on a college basis. The training of military cooks, which there is some debate on, and the person who rejected my article, he said they're trained all the way along. There was a program started for military cooks. It was started by civilians, ran for about 10 years, where civilian chefs would actually spend time on ships teaching the CS's culinary specialists how to cook. And it was the only training that they were getting after their first initial 2 weeks. Airline cooks is a problem. Most airline food is produced by contractors. Gourmet Gate is Gate Gourmet is probably the biggest. And they run into the issue, you know, if you're an international airline, how do you train cooks in all the different kitchens to cook the same food the same way? You know, just even now in one place, you know, do people turn a whole, you know, hotel pan versus steaks one at a time or all at once? So there's all these different issues that are in that training. And they've started, maybe 10 years ago now, schools, medical schools have a small section on teaching doctors about nutrition. And that has, you know, has changed. They're trying to do it, but they're not, in my opinion, they're not doing a very good job, because they're doing mainly just teaching recipes and not really studying nutrition. And the, you know, notes have gone from, you know, the scrapbooks to what my mother had was index cards and notebooks. Nowadays, most people are keeping their recipes, you know, on their computer. So in the 21st century, culinary schools are no longer feasible. The food sections and newspapers pretty much are extinct, the New York Times and the Washington Post, a few other papers. Television cooking programs are now entertainment. Recipe and food journalism has moved online, which can be either good or bad. Podcasts are flourishing, and like, you know, people who taught cooking in various places, in order to do a podcast doesn't mean you have to have any expertise. Blogs are another way like that. They have exploded, although they are beginning to decrease, because it's just the market is just too saturated, and people who write blogs or start blogs often don't realize they have to keep it up on a, you know, a periodic basis. And like I said, cookbooks are still selling strong. So if you're open to the idea, culinary education comes from everywhere, and which I certainly, obviously, am strongly believe. And repeating aside, you know, again, that the problem with a lot of culinary education is that it's recipe based. Culinary education has to be successful, has to teach methods, techniques, and ingredients. I got obviously ahead of myself here a little bit. And the unfortunate thing, though, is today most culinary education no longer does that. It's the emphasis is on recipes. So we'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. That was really